On this week's podcast episode, I felt the need to talk about the topic of feeling like you let your family down. Okay. That's what I wanted to talk about this week because when it comes to divorce, there's a lot of unpleasant feelings that you will have when going through this process. And one of those feelings is the feeling of failure. Because when you feel like you've let others down, you ultimately can feel like a personal failure. And for those who are currently listening right now, you may be experiencing a deep feeling that you've let others down, right? Maybe you feel like you didn't have what it takes to keep your family together. Maybe you feel like you disappointed your kids and that they will be a product of what society defines as a broken home. Maybe you feel like because you are a person who passionately fights for the things that they love, like you ride or die, you all in, right? You go for the things that you love and you go for the things that you want, that your dedicated effort should have been enough for this relationship to sustain. You also may feel like others have admired you all's relationship, which brings a level of expectancy to maintain that persona. And because the outcome fell short of what others anticipated for your marriage, you feel embarrassed. You may also feel like you came from a family where you saw divorces happen and you promised yourself that it would be different for you. You may also feel like you came from a family where long lasting marriages were the norm, creating an expectation to follow in those footsteps. You may also feel like you're a complete and total disappointment to God. And when you feel like you're in a state of failure and feeling like you let others down, it can become a manifestation of shame, disappointment, embarrassment, self-doubt, hopelessness, anxiety, depression, to even a distorted self-image of how you perceive yourself to be. And although feeling like you may have failed and that you may have let others down, that's a normal reaction to have. However, we don't want to remain in this emotional state because that's where the problem lies. Because when you remain in that emotional state of failure, you begin to live in fear, right? Where you will avoid doing things due to your past disappointments. You may find yourself self-sabotaging. You may find yourself becoming extremely self-critical, which only decreases your self-esteem. You lose trust in your judgment and your abilities, and you're not as optimistic about your life going forward. And so, what I wanted to do today on this episode was give you all three things that I want you to remind yourself of when you find yourself feeling like you failed. That's what I want to do. And so, I'm going to go over three things today that you need to remind yourself of. All right. So, the first thing that you need to remind yourself of is that you need to remind yourself that it didn't fail. It just didn't work out. That's the first thing. You need to remind yourself that it didn't fail. It just didn't work out. And why is it important to see it in this way? Because your perspective on how you see failure will impact how you move forward. Okay. And so what this means is that we must now realign our current understanding on what we have perceived failure to be. Okay. Because sometimes we can have a rooted belief. Okay. And when I say something is rooted, that means that sometimes we don't even know how rooted it is because it's so deeply ingrained that failure is inherently bad or is actually a personal flaw. So, what we end up doing when we have this rooted belief is that we make failure become a label. Okay. We make failure become a label of who we are, as opposed to seeing this as an experience that we can actually learn and grow from. And when you don't realign an elevated perspective around failure that will allow you to learn and grow from, you unknowingly treat this as an everlasting punishment for you. And let me be clear. I want to be clear on something. This everlasting punishment that I'm referring to is normally stem from a core belief that you have affirmed to be true about you. And so what everlasting punishment does is that it does create unnecessary suffering for yourself. It does. And so you might find yourself in this continuous cycle of shame, guilt, self-blame, self-criticism, to even victimhood a lot longer than you should, because of this very narrow and distorted view of how you perceive failure to be for you. And so when you do something like this, you don't extend self-forgiveness, grace, or even compassion over yourself because you don't believe that you deserve it. And I talked about self-forgiveness earlier this year, podcast number 117. It's called The Skill of Self-Forgiveness, Why It's Needed, and 4 Things That You Need to Do. And I'm going to put that down in the show notes because it really is important to learn that in order to realize that we can't live or function on a rooted belief of failure, we have to learn how to extend this thing called self-forgiveness, right? You also don't use this experience as an opportunity to evolve. And you also don't give yourself permission to redesign how you want to live your next chapter. And so when you don't give yourself permission to redesign a new chapter, you find yourself living in this thing called autopilot to even survival mode. And so for point number 1, I challenge you to ask yourself these 2 questions. What core belief have I held to be true about what failure is for me? I want you to think about that. I want you to think about, what have you defined failure to be for you? And I also want you to ask yourself, do I associate who I am with failure when something doesn't work out as expected? Okay. And so that's the first one. The first thing you need to remind yourself of is that it didn't fail. It just didn't work out. Okay. The second thing that I want you to remind yourself of is that you need to remind yourself of who you are. That's the second thing. The second thing is you got to remind yourself of who you are. Here's the thing, and I don't have data on this. I'm going to be honest. I don't have no kind of data on this, but this is what I deeply believe. I deeply believe that the majority of those who decide to get married doesn't intentionally get married to get a divorce. I believe that wholeheartedly. I don't believe that those who got to the point of where divorce became the decision, that it was actually intentionally done on purpose. And what I mean by that is that this wasn't the plan for them. Okay. This wasn't the expectation. This wasn't the desired result or even outcome. And the reason why I needed to say that, because this is why many feel like they failed when divorce happens. And when the expectation doesn't align with the desired outcome, feeling like you failed and you let those around you down is deeply discouraging. And what this also can do is that it actually can cause you to forget who you are. I'm telling you, it can, because this belief that you failed creates an unhealthy perception of you. It can. And this could also have the potential for you to overlook your value. Because, see, we often associate, whether this is on a conscious level or even on an unconscious level, we often associate our value based on our accomplishments. That's normally the exchange, where our sense of worthiness and feeling good about ourselves only comes from what we do well. So if it works, we feel good about ourselves. We feel worthy. We feel like because it worked, this validates our worthiness. So guess what happens if it doesn't work? We feel less worthy. We feel like because it didn't work, that we're not worthy. And when that is always the exchange of determining who you are, your value as a person will always be connected to your external outcome and results. And so in saying that, somebody may be thinking, well, Tanya, shouldn't I always strive to be my best? And my reply would be absolutely. However, even in doing your absolute best, that doesn't always guarantee the desired result. And even in doing your best, that doesn't exempt you from the unplanned and the unknown. And when it comes to something such as a divorce, that's an unpredictable life event. And with that being said, it's important to know that your worth, as well as your identity, extends beyond any specific life event or relationship. And when you're in this state of feeling like you failed, you have to start reminding yourself of who you are, because you can lose that. And this is where you want to take some uninterrupted time and think about, what do you value about yourself? What amazing traits do you possess? What have people noticed about your character that sets you apart? What does your creator say about me? And I throw this in here because I tell people all the time, I'm a believer. And because I am a believer, I had to get very deeply rooted in what God said about me. When I realized that I was fearfully and wonderfully made, when I realized that I was perfect in his image, when I realized that I was the head and not the tail, and the lender and not the borrower, when I really believed that for myself, it gave me a reminder of who I am. And here's the thing, if this doesn't come easy for you right now, because that's another thing, when you're going through this process of going through a divorce, sometimes seeing all of who you are may not necessarily be as clear for you right now. Then reach out to someone that you know that you're close with and consider asking them. Because when you're in this state, seeing it may not come as easy. And sometimes we may need someone else to see it for us. Okay. And so that's the second thing you need to remind yourself of. You need to remind yourself of who you are, because we can easily get this slight bit of amnesia and forget that about us. All right. And so the third thing, and this is the last thing that I want you to remind yourself of, is that you need to remind yourself that it won't always feel like this. That's the third one. The third one is you need to remind yourself that it won't always feel like this. Here's what I want you to remember. Just because you feel like a failure doesn't mean you are a failure. Okay? And I'm going to say that again. Just because you feel like a failure doesn't mean you are a failure. Because when it comes to these feelings, like these feelings, y'all, I'm telling you, honey, these feelings, they feel so strong, where they feel so real that we make them right. Meaning that we make these feelings factual, we make these feelings true, we make these feelings concrete, and we make these feelings absolute. Now, when it comes to feelings, here are two truths about feelings that I want you to remember. The first thing is that your feelings are real, meaning that your feelings are a response to something. So what this means is that your feelings are not to be denied. They are not to be dismissed. Neither are they meant to be disregarded. Okay, your feelings are there for a reason, and it's up to you to really allow yourself to feel what it is that you're currently feeling and be unapologetic about it. Now, with that being said, the second truth is that your feelings are not always right. Okay, meaning that your feelings are not facts, right? They're not something that we should define as truth. Neither should we make how we feel be so concrete and correct. And so here's the thing. Feeling like a failure after divorce is normal, right? Because you could be identifying this as a loss for you right now. However, you don't want to make the temporary feeling of failure become your permanent residence on how you function. Okay? Because if you do, this feeling of failure is going to be a powerful influence on how you think as well as what you do. Because it becomes your focus, right? Failure becomes your focus, which also means this is where your energy goes. And your energy only flows where your attention goes. So if your attention is focused on how much of a failure you are, then you will begin to think and move in a way that affirms that feeling of failure. And the more that's repeated, the more it becomes your reality. I want to share something with you all. So I do a lot of reading, right? And I developed this habit of reading being a part of my daily life about 8 years ago when I made a decision that I wanted to change the trajectory. And I read about maybe 30 minutes to an hour a day. And from that, I've read a lot of books. I've read a lot of stories about some great and amazing people. And I also really do like documentaries as well. And over the course of these 8 years, I've heard some amazing stories from people who have faced some very challenging circumstances in their lives where it really has left me to tears, seeing their ability to overcome despite of what happened in their lives. And it made me see that they couldn't have done any of that if all they did was feel like they were a failure. And I say that because, as I mentioned, I deeply believe that the majority of those who get married doesn't intentionally sign up to get a divorce. And what this means is that there are many people who have experienced divorce. However, there are many who made a decision to not allow divorce to be their ultimate destination. And so what this means is that even though you feel like a failure right now, you can also decide to move past not feeling like one. Because divorce can sometimes make you feel like you're not in control, as if you're powerless, as if you're inadequate, incapable to even being very vulnerable. And what that can easily do is cause you to think that you don't have a choice, even in the midst of feeling like you failed. But I want to humbly remind you today that it won't always feel like this. And that's what you have to tell yourself. Even when the feeling of failure tries to creep in, even when it doesn't look like it's working, even when the inner critic wants to get loud and tell you something different, even when things are unfolding in ways that hurt, it won't always feel like this. And when you allow yourself to remind yourself of this, you're also reminding yourself that you will move past this. And this reminder becomes your anchor to hope and resiliency. This reminder becomes your motivation to move forward, even when it's challenging. This reminder becomes your new elevated belief that affirms your ability to overcome, learn, and grow beyond this experience. And this reminder also becomes your catalyst for change and healing that guides you to a more fulfilling next chapter. And so I understand what failure feels like when you go through a divorce, because that's what I initially experienced myself. I felt like I let my kids down. I felt like I let God down. I felt like I let those who looked up to me down. Like I felt that. I did. However, I had to remind myself of a couple of things. I had to remind myself that just because it didn't work out doesn't mean I failed. I had to remind myself of who I am. And I also had to remind myself that just because I feel this way doesn't make it a fact. Okay. And so I just want to encourage you all today that as you go along on this journey of transitioning, and even though you may feel like a failure, know that that's a normal reaction to have. However, what's also normal and what also can become our new normal is realizing that we can decide to get past that feeling. Okay. And so I hope that this podcast episode this week was a blessing to you. I hope that this was something that you can take away and apply to your journey on moving forward and embracing your next chapter. Okay. So please make sure that you are following me on my social media handles. My Instagram is I am Tanya Carter. My Facebook and YouTube is Tanya Carter. I will put the link down in the show notes. And also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the podcast so that you can receive notifications on when the next podcast episode will drop. And also leave a review. If you know that this podcast has been very influential for you on your transitioning out of a relationship and embracing your next chapter, then please head over to Spotify and or iTunes and leave me a review. And last but definitely not least, share this information. If you know somebody who is feeling like they're a failure and is having difficulty getting past that feeling of failure, then please make sure that you share this episode so that it can be a blessing for them in this season. Okay. So thank you all again for tuning in with me this week. You all have a wonderful and amazing week, and I will see you next time.